In the heart of Vatican City, behind reinforced doors and under constant surveillance, lies one of the world's most restricted repositories of human knowledge. The Vatican Apostolic Library contains documents spanning nearly 2 millennia, yet only a handful of scholars gain access each year. This restriction has fed speculation for centuries. What exactly is preserved within these walls? And what distinguishes legitimate historical secrecy from the myths that have accumulated around this institution? The answers require examining not just what the library contains, but how it came to exist and why it operates as it does. Because while popular imagination has filled the Vatican Library with conspiracy and forbidden knowledge, the documented reality is both more complex and more historically significant. To understand the Vatican Library, we must first understand the world that created it. The library's official foundation date is 1475, under Pope Sixtus IV, but this date marks formalization rather than beginning. The Catholic Church had been systematically collecting documents for over a millennium before Sixtus established the library as a distinct institution. From Christianity's earliest centuries, the Church recognized that preserving written records served multiple purposes. Theological texts defined doctrine. Correspondence documented relationships with secular powers. Legal documents established property rights and jurisdictional claims. Historical records provided legitimacy. The accumulation wasn't merely cultural preservation, it was institutional necessity. By the medieval period, the papal court maintained extensive archives, but these remained primarily administrative rather than scholarly collections. Documents were stored for their legal and political utility, not for their intellectual value. The transition from archive to library, from administrative storage to intellectual resource, occurred during a specific historical moment, the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance represented more than artistic flourishing. It was characterized by intense interest in recovering classical knowledge that had been lost or neglected during the medieval period. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had sent Greek scholars fleeing westward, bringing manuscripts that had been preserved in the Byzantine Empire. Simultaneously, the development of printing technology by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was revolutionizing how information could be preserved and distributed. Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from 1471 to 1484, understood these developments' significance. He had been a Franciscan friar and theology professor before his elevation to the papacy, giving him appreciation for scholarship that some of his predecessors lacked. In 1475, he issued a bull formally establishing the Vatican Library as an institution distinct from the general papal archives. Sixtus's vision was ambitious. He intended to create not merely a repository for church documents, but a comprehensive collection representing human knowledge across disciplines. The library would house theological works, certainly, but also classical literature, scientific treatises, philosophical texts, legal documents, and historical records. The goal was universality, echoing the great libraries of antiquity, particularly the Library of Alexandria. This ambition required substantial resources. Sixtus appointed the humanist scholar Bartolomeo Platina as the first official librarian, giving him budget and authority to acquire manuscripts from across Europe and beyond. Platina was an interesting choice, a scholar who had previously been imprisoned by a different pope for suspected conspiracy. His appointment demonstrated that Sixtus valued intellectual credentials over political orthodoxy, at least in this context. The timing was crucial. The library's foundation coincided with the height of Italian Renaissance culture. Wealthy families were competing to demonstrate cultural sophistication through patronage. Scholars were traveling throughout Europe and the Mediterranean seeking classical manuscripts. The printing press was beginning to make texts more widely available. Sixtus positioned the Vatican to capitalize on all these trends. Initial acquisitions focused on quality over quantity. Platina and his successors sought the most complete and accurate versions of important texts. They purchased private collections from scholars and nobles who needed funds. They commissioned copies of works held elsewhere. They accepted donations from those seeking papal favor. The collection grew systematically rather than haphazardly. By the time of Sixtus's death in 1484, the library held approximately 3,500 manuscripts, a substantial collection for that era. More importantly, the institutional framework was established. The library had dedicated space, professional staff, acquisition budget, and intellectual mission. Subsequent popes would expand the collection, but the foundation was laid. The library's location within the Vatican complex was significant. It wasn't separated from the center of papal power, but integrated into it. This physical proximity to authority served dual purposes. It protected the collection under the same security that guarded the Pope. It also ensured that church leadership had immediate access to documents they might need for theological, legal, or political purposes. The collection's scope expanded under subsequent popes, particularly during the 16th century, as European powers competed for global influence, and the Protestant Reformation challenged Catholic authority. The library became a repository not just for religious texts, but for the diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, and political records that the papal court generated in enormous volume. Understanding this context is essential. The Vatican Library didn't emerge from conspiracy or a desire to hide knowledge. It developed as a Renaissance institution, reflecting humanist values while serving institutional church needs. Its restrictions, which we'll examine later, stem from this dual nature, simultaneously a scholarly resource and an institutional archive containing sensitive material. The library's expansion through the 16th and 17th centuries occurred against a backdrop of religious upheaval and political transformation. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517 with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, challenged Catholic authority throughout Northern Europe. The Church's response, known as the Counter-Reformation, included intellectual as well as political components. Preserving and controlling religious texts became strategically important. The library acquired manuscripts related to early church history, patristic writings, and theological debates. These materials served dual purposes, providing resources for Catholic scholars, defending orthodox doctrine, and keeping potentially problematic texts under institutional control. The acquisition methods varied. Some materials came through purchase, particularly from private collections in Protestant regions where Catholic materials were being dispersed. Others arrived as gifts from Catholic rulers seeking papal favor. Still others were confiscated from religious orders that were suppressed or reformed. One significant expansion occurred under Pope Paul V, who reigned from 1605 to 1621. Paul oversaw the incorporation of the Palatine Library of Heidelberg, one of the most significant collections in Protestant Germany. This library had been seized by Catholic forces during the 30 Years' War and transported to Rome as spoils of war in 1623. The Heidelberg acquisition added approximately 3,500 manuscripts and 5,000 printed books to the Vatican's holdings. These included important medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and Protestant theological works that would otherwise have been unavailable to Catholic scholars. The acquisition demonstrated how military conflict directly affected library collections. Throughout this period, The library also accumulated extensive diplomatic correspondence. As the papacy negotiated with European powers regarding political and religious matters, the documentation of these negotiations was preserved. Letters between popes and monarchs, reports from papal nuncios serving as ambassadors, and documentation of church councils all entered the collection. These diplomatic materials are historically significant beyond their original context. They provide detailed documentation of European political history from a unique perspective. The papacy maintained relationships with all major Catholic powers and many Protestant ones, making papal correspondence a valuable source for diplomatic historians. The 18th century brought new challenges. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and skepticism toward religious authority created intellectual pressure on church institutions. Simultaneously, political developments threatened the papacy's temporal power. The library's role shifted somewhat from active acquisition to preservation of existing holdings. During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, the library faced its most serious threat since foundation. When French forces occupied Rome in 1798, they seized numerous manuscripts and transported them to Paris. The stated justification was that these materials represented universal human heritage that should be accessible to all, not controlled by the Church. Napoleon's cultural officials selected approximately 500 of the library's most valuable manuscripts for transfer to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. These included ancient biblical codices, classical texts, and important medieval manuscripts. The loss was significant, representing some of the collection's crown jewels. However, following Napoleon's defeat and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, diplomatic negotiations resulted in many manuscripts returned to Rome. The process was incomplete, and some materials remained in Paris, but the majority came back. This experience reinforced the Vatican's protective attitude toward its collections. The 19th century saw the library's gradual opening to scholars, a development we'll examine in detail shortly. But expansion also continued. The library acquired the collections of several dissolved religious houses and private libraries. By 1900, the manuscript collection numbered approximately 60,000 items, with printed books numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The 20th century brought both world wars and their associated disruptions, but also technological developments that would transform how the library functioned. Photography enabled reproduction of fragile manuscripts without handling originals. Later, microfilm and digital technology would further reduce wear on physical documents. Today, the library holds approximately 80,000 manuscripts and over 1.6 million printed books. But these numbers don't capture the collection's true significance. Many manuscripts are unique, existing nowhere else. Others are the earliest or most complete versions of important texts. The collection's value lies not in quantity, but in quality and historical importance. The library also houses extensive map collections, including medieval world maps and early modern cartographic materials documenting European exploration. There are astronomical treatises, medical texts, mathematical manuscripts, and scientific correspondence. The collection truly spans human intellectual endeavor across centuries. Understanding this developmental history is crucial for evaluating claims about what the library contains. The collection wasn't assembled according to a single plan, but accumulated over centuries through diverse mechanisms. Some materials were actively sought, others arrived by accident of circumstance, and still others were preserved simply because they existed in papal possession. One persistent source of speculation about the Vatican Library concerns what it contains that hasn't been catalogued. This concern has some basis in reality, though perhaps not the implications conspiracy theorists draw from it. The challenge of cataloging the collection is substantial, with tens of thousands of manuscripts, many containing multiple texts, and over 1 million printed books. Creating a comprehensive catalog is an enormous undertaking. The work has been ongoing for centuries and remains incomplete. The first significant cataloging efforts began in the late 16th century. Cardinal Federico Borromeo, who would later found the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, advocated for systematic cataloging. His proposals led to initial inventories, though these were far from comprehensive by modern standards. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, various librarians attempted more systematic approaches. Cardinal Francesco Barberini oversaw significant cataloging work in the 1630s. Later librarians continued these efforts, but the collection's size and continuous growth made completion impossible with available resources and technology. The situation improved significantly in the 19th century. The first printed catalogue appeared in 1883, over 400 years after the library's foundation. This catalogue, while incomplete, provided the first publicly accessible inventory of major holdings. Scholars could now identify materials relevant to their research without traveling to Rome. However, the 1883 catalogue covered only a fraction of the collection. Many manuscripts remained uncatalogued or were listed only in handwritten inventories accessible only on site. This incomplete cataloging has several implications. First, it means researchers might not know what materials could be relevant to their work. A scholar studying medieval theology might be unaware of relevant manuscripts because they're not in the public catalogue. This creates genuine research barriers unrelated to any deliberate secrecy. Second, incomplete cataloging makes it difficult for the library staff themselves to provide access. When a researcher requests materials on a specific topic, staff must search not just the public catalogue, but also various internal inventories and their own institutional knowledge. This slows the access process. Third, the gaps in the catalogue feed speculation. If the library hasn't catalogued everything, what might be hiding in uncatalogued materials? Could there be documents of enormous significance that nobody knows about? The answer is possibly, but probably not anything earth-shattering. Modern cataloging efforts have accelerated. Digital technology enables creation of searchable databases linking to digital images of manuscripts. Since the late 20th century, systematic digitization has progressed alongside cataloging. Tens of thousands of manuscripts have been photographed or scanned, with the images linked to catalog entries. The digitization project serves multiple purposes. It provides access to scholars worldwide without requiring travel to Rome. It preserves information about documents' contents, even if physical manuscripts deteriorate. And it reduces handling of fragile originals, which extends their lifespan. However, digitization raises new questions. Which materials should be digitized first? The most important works have priority, but importance is subjective. Frequently requested items obviously need digitization, but this creates a self-reinforcing pattern where already known materials become more accessible while lesser-known items remain obscure. There's also the question of what gets made publicly accessible versus what remains restricted even in digital form. Some materials are digitized for preservation but not made publicly available online. This might be due to copyright concerns for recent materials, conservation concerns for fragile items, or privacy considerations for documents containing personal information about living individuals. The cataloging challenge isn't unique to the Vatican. Major libraries worldwide face similar issues. The British Library, The Library of Congress and national libraries throughout Europe have backlogs of uncatalogued materials. The Vatican situation is notable, mainly because the institution's general aura of secrecy extends to this ordinary library problem. What's important to understand is that uncatalogued doesn't mean hidden or secret in any conspiratorial sense. It means that with limited staff and resources, some materials haven't yet received full descriptive treatment. As technology improves and resources permit, cataloging continues. The process is ongoing, not complete, but that's true of major libraries generally. The Vatican has made significant efforts toward transparency in recent decades. More of the catalog is available online. Digitization continues. Access procedures, while still strict, are more clearly defined than in the past. The trend is toward greater openness, not increased secrecy. Perhaps no aspect of the Vatican Library generates more speculation than its access restrictions. Understanding these restrictions requires examining both their historical development and current implementation. For centuries after its founding, the library was essentially private. Access was at the discretion of the librarian or pope, granted primarily to scholars with personal connections or explicit approval from high church officials. This wasn't unusual for the era. Most significant libraries were private collections, accessible only to owners and their associates. The major shift came in 1881, when Pope Leo XIII opened the library to qualified researchers. This decision was significant, representing a deliberate choice to make materials available for scholarly research, rather than keeping them exclusively for church use. However, Leo's opening came with substantial restrictions that remain in place today. The goal was to enable legitimate research while protecting materials from damage and ensuring that access served scholarly rather than sensationalist purposes. Current access procedures are rigorous. Researchers must apply formally, providing detailed information about their qualifications and research project. A doctoral degree or equivalent academic credentials is typically required, though exceptions can be made for researchers with substantial publication records or institutional affiliations. The application must specify exactly what materials the researcher needs to consult and why. Vague requests to see what you have on a broad topic are rejected. Researchers must demonstrate specific knowledge of what they need and legitimate scholarly reasons for accessing those particular materials. Letters of recommendation from recognized scholars or academic institutions are required. These letters must attest to the applicant's qualifications and the research project's legitimacy. The recommendation requirement serves as a credibility filter, ensuring that access goes to serious researchers. Once approved, researchers face additional restrictions. Access is granted for specific materials related to the approved research project. Browsing through collections to see what might be interesting isn't permitted. This targeted access approach protects materials from unnecessary handling. Photography was historically forbidden, though this has relaxed somewhat. Researchers can now request permission to photograph manuscripts in certain circumstances, though this requires additional approval. The restriction aims to prevent flash photography or improper handling that might damage materials. Note-taking is permitted, but researchers must work under supervision. Library staff monitor reading rooms to ensure materials are handled properly and that researchers comply with regulations. This supervision might seem intrusive, but it's standard practice in archives containing unique, irreplaceable materials. The restricted access has legitimate justifications beyond the obvious ones of protecting fragile materials. Many documents in the collection contain private information about individuals. Diplomatic correspondence might include sensitive assessments of political leaders. Church disciplinary records contain personal information about clergy. Medical or legal documents might include confidential material. Making everything immediately and freely accessible could violate privacy, damage diplomatic relationships, or expose individuals to harassment. This is why most major archives impose some restrictions on recent materials, typically using a time-based rule like a 50-year or 100-year closure period. The Vatican applies similar principles, but with additional considerations related to its unique status as both a religious institution and a sovereign state. Some materials touch on internal church matters that institution considers properly confidential. Others involve diplomatic relations, where premature disclosure could cause problems. Comparisons with other major libraries are instructive. The British Library and the Library of Congress are often cited as more open, but this requires nuance. Both institutions have freely accessible reading rooms where anyone can consult most materials. However, both also have restricted collections, requiring special permission. The British Library restricts access to some recent political papers, materials containing personal information, and items deemed too fragile for general handling. The Library of Congress has similar restrictions on certain government documents, private papers, and conservation-sensitive materials. The Vatican's restrictions are more extensive, but the difference is one of degree rather than kind. The perception of unusual secrecy stems partly from the institution's nature. As a religious and political entity with a long history of controversial decisions, the Vatican attracts more suspicion than secular national libraries. Another factor is the romanticized view of what secrets might be hidden. The idea that the Vatican holds earth-shattering revelations about religious history, political conspiracies, or ancient mysteries is more compelling than the mundane reality that most restricted materials are routine correspondence, administrative records, or documents subject to standard privacy concerns. In recent decades, the Vatican has made genuine efforts to increase openness. The most significant was the 2020 opening of Pope Pius XII's archives, previously sealed. This opening allowed researchers to examine materials from one of the most controversial periods in church history: the papacy during World War II and the Holocaust. The decision to open these archives wasn't without controversy. Some Jewish groups and historians had long criticized Pius XII's alleged silence regarding the Holocaust. Others defended him, arguing he worked behind the scenes to save Jewish lives. Opening the archives allowed researchers to examine the documentary evidence. What emerged was a more complex picture than either simple narrative suggested. The documents showed Pius was aware of Nazi atrocities and did take some actions, including sheltering Jews in Vatican properties. But they also confirmed he avoided public condemnation of Nazi Germany, prioritizing Vatican neutrality and institutional interests. This opening demonstrated both progress toward transparency and the continuing challenges. Researchers gained access to materials that had been sealed, enabling more informed historical analysis. However, the process took decades. The materials were made available only to qualified researchers under standard restrictions, and the sheer volume meant comprehensive analysis would require years. The Pius XII opening represents a model for how the Vatican approaches historical controversies. Rather than maintaining perpetual secrecy, materials are eventually opened once enough time has passed that immediate political or personal sensitivities are reduced. But the timeline is measured in decades, not years, which from a historical perspective may seem reasonable, but from a contemporary perspective appears slow. Understanding these access restrictions requires recognizing their dual nature. They serve legitimate purposes, protecting fragile materials, respecting privacy, maintaining diplomatic discretion, and ensuring scholarly rather than sensationalist use. But they also generate suspicion, particularly given the institution's historical role in controversies involving suppression of ideas deemed heretical. The key question is whether current restrictions are justified by the stated purposes or whether they're excessive, hiding materials that should be accessible. The answer likely varies case by case. Some restrictions seem clearly justified by conservation or privacy concerns. Others might be excessive, protecting institutional reputation rather than legitimate confidentiality. What's clear is that the trend has been toward greater openness, not increased secrecy. More materials are accessible now than at any previous point in the library's history. Digitization and catalog expansion continue. The question is whether the pace is adequate or whether further steps toward transparency are warranted. While speculation about what the Vatican Library might contain often focuses on the mysterious or controversial, the documented contents include numerous items of undeniable historical significance. Examining these materials provides context for understanding what the library actually preserves. One of the most historically consequential documents is the 1527 letter from King Henry of England to Pope Clement requesting annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This seemingly routine request for a marriage annulment triggered events that would permanently alter the religious landscape of Europe. Henry's situation was complex. He had married Catherine, his brother's widow, under a papal dispensation granted by Pope Julius. By 1527, after nearly 20 years of marriage, Catherine had not provided a male heir. Henry sought annulment on grounds that the original dispensation was invalid because the Bible forbade marrying a brother's widow. The theological and legal arguments were intricate. Some biblical passages seemed to support Henry's position, others contradicted it. Precedent existed for papal annulments in similarly ambiguous cases. Under different circumstances, Clement might have granted the request. However, political considerations proved decisive. Catherine was aunt to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the most powerful monarch in Europe. Charles opposed the annulment and had recently sacked Rome in 1527, holding the Pope effectively captive. Granting Henry's request would antagonize Charles at a moment when the papacy could ill afford another powerful enemy. Clement delayed, equivocated, and eventually denied the request. Henry's response was radical. He broke with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church in England through the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This English Reformation created a new Protestant national church and permanently divided Western Christianity. The document itself, Henry's original letter, represents the starting point of this chain of events. It's written in formal Latin, following diplomatic protocols of the era. The rhetoric is deferential, expressing confidence that the Pope will recognize the theological merits of the case. There's no hint of the cataclysm that would follow the request's denial. Historians studying the English Reformation rely heavily on this correspondence and related documents in the Vatican archives. The materials provide the Catholic perspective on events that English sources naturally present differently. They reveal the diplomatic pressures and theological arguments that shaped the papal response. Another document of major historical significance is the complete protocol of the trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633. This trial has become symbolic of the conflict between science and religious authority, and the Vatican's records provide the most complete documentation of what actually occurred. Galileo's conflict with church authorities centered on his support for heliocentrism, the theory that the Earth revolves around the Sun, rather than standing stationary at the universe's center. This theory, proposed earlier by Copernicus, contradicted the prevailing Aristotelian cosmology that the Church had incorporated into its theology. The issue was complicated. Heliocentrism wasn't merely a scientific question, but touched on biblical interpretation. Several scriptural passages seem to describe a stationary Earth and moving Sun. Church authorities, still reeling from the Protestant Reformation's challenge to their interpretive authority, were sensitive about accepting scientific theories that contradicted traditional biblical understanding. Galileo had initially been warned in 1616 to treat heliocentrism as a mathematical hypothesis rather than physical reality. He apparently agreed, but in 1632 published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, which clearly advocated heliocentrism despite formal gestures toward neutrality. This led to his trial by the Inquisition in 1633. The Vatican Archives contain the complete trial records, the charges, Galileo's testimony, the theological consultants' opinions, and the final sentence. These documents reveal a more complex situation than the simple narrative of science persecuted by religion suggests. The trial records show that Galileo's personal arrogance and political missteps contributed to his conviction as much as pure theological objection to heliocentrism. His dialogue had portrayed the traditionalist position through a character named Simplicio, Italian for simpleton, which was widely interpreted as mocking Pope Urban VIII, previously a Galileo supporter. The sentence was severe by modern standards: house arrest for the remainder of his life, and a requirement to publicly abjure heliocentrism. However, the execution or torture that might have been imposed in heresy cases was avoided. Galileo spent his remaining years under comfortable house arrest, continuing his scientific work. The trial documents have been studied extensively by historians of science and religion. They provide detailed evidence for analyzing how religious institutions respond to scientific challenges to traditional belief. They also document the gradual, often painful process by which scientific understanding displaces older worldviews. The Church's handling of Galileo has become a symbol of institutional resistance to truth. The gradual rehabilitation of Galileo's reputation, culminating in Pope John Paul II's 1992 acknowledgement that the Church erred in condemning him, represents institutional recognition of this historical wrong. The Vatican Archives also contain extensive diplomatic correspondence, documenting the Church's relationships with European powers across centuries. These materials include letters between popes and monarchs, reports from papal nuncios serving as ambassadors, and documentation of peace negotiations and military alliances. One particularly significant collection concerns the 30 Years' War, the devastating conflict that ravaged Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. Papal diplomacy played a crucial role in attempts to negotiate peace, and the Vatican Archives document these efforts in detail. The correspondence reveals the complex interplay of religious and political motives throughout the war. What began as a Catholic-Protestant religious conflict evolved into a broader struggle for political power in which religious allegiance became as much a tool of statecraft as a genuine cause. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the war, established principles that would shape European international relations for centuries. The Vatican Archives contain documentation of papal objections to some treaty provisions, particularly those granting legal recognition to Protestant states, which from the papal perspective compromised religious truth for political expedience. Another category of historically significant documents concerns the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Established in 1559 and maintained until 1966, the index listed books that Catholics were forbidden to read without special permission. The records of the Congregation of the Index, the Vatican office that maintained this list, are preserved in the archives. These records document which books were prohibited, the theological or moral grounds for prohibition, and the process by which books were evaluated. The index included works by major philosophers, scientists, and literary figures. Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Hume, and Kant all had works listed. Galileo's Dialogue appeared, as did Copernicus's De Revolutionibus. Novels by Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Émile Zola were prohibited. From a contemporary perspective, the index appears to be censorship suppressing intellectual freedom. From the Church's perspective at the time, it was protecting the faithful from ideas deemed theologically erroneous or morally corrupting. The index records document how the Church attempted to control information in an era when such control was increasingly difficult. The archives also contain materials related to the Spanish Inquisition and other inquisitorial tribunals. These records document cases investigated, evidence presented, verdicts rendered, and punishments imposed. They provide primary source material for understanding how inquisitorial justice functioned. Modern historians have used these records to challenge some popular misconceptions about the Inquisition. While the Inquisition did prosecute and punish people for religious nonconformity, the documentary evidence suggests that execution was less common than popular imagination assumes, and that inquisitorial procedures, while harsh by modern standards, included protections absent from secular criminal justice of the same era. This doesn't excuse or minimize the Inquisition's injustices. People were persecuted for their beliefs, subjected to torture, and sometimes executed. The point is that the archival records provide evidence for nuanced historical understanding rather than simple morality tales. The variety of historically significant materials in the Vatican archives demonstrates that the library's importance lies not in hidden secrets but in documented reality. The primary sources preserved there enable scholars to study major events in European history, the development of Catholic theology and practice, and the complex relationships between religious and political power. Among the most persistent questions about the Vatican Library concerns whether it holds apocryphal Gospels, texts about Jesus' life and teachings that weren't included in the New Testament canon. Understanding this question requires clarifying what apocryphal Gospels are, which ones exist, and what the Vatican Library actually contains. The New Testament canon, the collection of texts recognized as authoritative Christian scripture, was established through a gradual process in the early centuries of Christianity. By the 4th century CE, widespread consensus existed regarding the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were considered authentic accounts based on apostolic authority. However, many other texts about Jesus circulated in early Christianity. Some claimed apostolic authorship. Others presented teachings attributed to Jesus. Still others described events in his life not covered in the canonical Gospels. Early church authorities faced the question of which texts to accept as genuine and which to reject. The criteria for canonicity included apostolic origin, consistency with accepted doctrine, and widespread use in established Christian communities. Texts that failed these tests were deemed apocryphal, meaning hidden or doubtful. This didn't necessarily mean they were false, but that they weren't considered authoritative for establishing doctrine. Several apocryphal Gospels are known to have existed in antiquity. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, was mentioned by early church fathers and is now known from a complete Coptic text discovered in Egypt in 1945. The Gospel of Peter, describing Jesus' passion and resurrection from a different perspective than the canonical Gospels, is partially preserved in a manuscript fragment. Other apocryphal texts include the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, and various infancy Gospels describing Jesus' childhood. Some of these texts present theological views diverging significantly from Orthodox Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains sayings that some scholars interpret as reflecting Gnostic beliefs, emphasizing secret knowledge over faith. The question is whether the Vatican Library holds apocryphal Gospels, particularly complete texts of works known only fragmentarily elsewhere. This question has two aspects: what the library actually contains and what might theoretically be there undiscovered. Regarding what the library actually contains, the answer is straightforward. The Vatican does hold manuscript copies of some apocryphal texts, but these are scholarly copies, not suppressed secrets. The library's collections include medieval and Renaissance manuscript copies of apocryphal Gospels that were studied by scholars even though they weren't considered canonical. These holdings aren't secret. They're catalogued and accessible to qualified researchers. Scholars studying early Christian literature regularly consult these manuscripts. The Vatican Library is simply one of many repositories holding copies of these texts. What the library doesn't appear to contain are previously unknown apocryphal Gospels of major significance. If such texts existed, their discovery would be announced and studied, not suppressed. The scholarly value would be enormous, and the Vatican has no obvious motive for concealing them. The theory that the Vatican hides apocryphal Gospels contradicting Orthodox doctrine rests on several misconceptions. First, it assumes that church authorities fear challenges to doctrine that might come from newly discovered texts. In reality, the Church has dealt with apocryphal texts throughout its history and has theological arguments for why they don't undermine orthodox beliefs. Second, it assumes that complete suppression is possible and desirable. But apocryphal Gospels exist in multiple manuscript traditions outside church control. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered in Egypt, not in church archives. The Gospel of Judas was purchased on the antiquities market. If significant texts exist, they're likely to surface through archaeological discovery or private collections rather than church revelation. Third, it misunderstands how manuscript discovery works. New texts are occasionally found, but usually fragmentarily in archaeological contexts like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Nag Hammadi Library. The notion of a complete, unknown gospel sitting undiscovered in the Vatican archives is implausible given the extensive cataloging and scholarly access. The Gospel of Judas provides an instructive example. This text, mentioned by the church father Irenaeus in the 2nd century CE, was thought lost. In the 1970s, a Coptic manuscript containing the text was discovered in Egypt. It changed hands through the antiquities market before being purchased by a foundation that arranged for its restoration, translation, and publication in 2006. The Gospel of Judas presents Judas Iscariot not as a traitor, but as Jesus' most faithful disciple, following Jesus' instructions to betray him so that crucifixion could occur. This radically different interpretation attracted significant media attention and scholarly analysis. If the Vatican had possessed a copy of the Gospel of Judas, there would have been no motive to conceal it. The text was already known to exist from ancient references. Its theological views, while heterodox, don't fundamentally challenge Christianity in ways that church scholars couldn't address, and scholarly and public interest in such a discovery would be enormous. The apocryphal Gospels that do exist provide valuable evidence for the diversity of early Christianity. They show that multiple interpretations of Jesus' significance existed in the first centuries after his death. They document theological debates that shaped Orthodox doctrine through the process of defining it against alternatives. The Vatican Library's holdings of apocryphal texts serve scholarly research into this early Christian diversity. The texts aren't hidden because there's nothing to hide. They're well known, extensively studied, and while theologically interesting, they don't contain revelations that would undermine Christianity as conspiracy theories sometimes suggest. What about the theoretical possibility of undiscovered texts? Could there be apocryphal Gospels in the uncatalogued portions of the collection that nobody knows about? This is theoretically possible, but unlikely to involve texts of major significance. Uncatalogued doesn't mean unexamined. Materials in the library have passed through many hands over centuries. Librarians have handled them, scholars have consulted them. The likelihood that a complete unknown gospel has sat unrecognized for centuries is extremely low. Moreover, if such a text were discovered during cataloging, it would be announced and studied, not suppressed. The scholarly and historical value would be immense. The discoverer would achieve instant academic fame. The Vatican would benefit from the publicity and scholarly interest. There's no plausible scenario where suppression serves anyone's interests. The persistence of theories about hidden apocryphal Gospels reflects several factors. The romance of undiscovered ancient texts appeals to imagination. The idea that authorities suppress uncomfortable truths satisfies suspicion of institutions, and popular works like the Da Vinci Code have embedded these notions in cultural consciousness. Understanding what apocryphal Gospels actually are, which ones exist, and how manuscript discovery actually works dispels much of the mystery. The Vatican Library contains valuable materials for studying early Christianity, including copies of apocryphal texts, but it doesn't hide earth-shattering secrets that would revolutionize Christianity if revealed. The physical infrastructure of the Vatican Library and associated archives has generated considerable speculation, particularly regarding underground storage facilities. Understanding what actually exists requires separating documented reality from embellished legend. The library and archives do have underground storage. This isn't secret, it's practical necessity. Proper preservation of manuscripts and documents requires controlled temperature and humidity. Underground facilities provide stable environments with minimal temperature fluctuation, protecting materials from deterioration. The Vatican's underground storage was developed gradually over centuries. The earliest storage spaces were simply cellars and vaults beneath existing buildings, used for securing valuable materials and providing some protection from fire, war, and environmental damage. More sophisticated underground facilities were constructed in the 20th century as preservation science advanced and the collection continued growing. These modern storage vaults incorporate climate control systems, maintaining precise temperature and humidity levels. Air filtering removes pollutants that could damage documents. Fire suppression systems provide protection without using water, which would destroy paper materials. The underground storage is organized systematically. Materials are housed in acid-free boxes and folders. Shelving is metal rather than wood, which can harbor insects and emit acids that damage paper. Lighting is carefully controlled, as excessive light exposure causes fading and deterioration. Access to these storage areas is restricted, but for practical rather than conspiratorial reasons. Climate control requires minimizing human entry, as people bring temperature fluctuations, humidity from respiration, and potential contaminants. Materials are retrieved by trained staff and brought to controlled reading rooms for consultation. The tunnel system connecting various Vatican buildings is real but has mundane origins. These passages were constructed over centuries for practical purposes. Some date to medieval times when they served as escape routes during military threats. Others were built later for administrative convenience, allowing movement between buildings without going outside. The most historically significant use of these tunnels occurred during the 1527 sack of Rome. When troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V attacked the city, Pope Clement VII used the Passetto di Borgo, a fortified corridor connecting the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo, to escape. This passage still exists and is occasionally opened for tours. Legends have elaborated on the actual tunnel system, claiming secret passages extending throughout Rome, connecting to ancient catacombs, or providing access to hidden chambers. Documentary evidence doesn't support these elaborations. The tunnels that exist are known, mapped, and serve identified purposes. The Vatican's underground spaces do include some areas not accessible to the public or even most staff. This is true of most large institutions with historic buildings. There are utility tunnels for pipes and electrical systems, storage areas for materials not frequently accessed, and spaces that are simply sealed off because they're structurally unsound or have no current use. The existence of restricted underground spaces naturally feeds speculation about what they might contain. However, the most likely answer is that they contain exactly what they're documented to contain: stored archival materials, utility infrastructure, and empty or unused spaces. Conservation requirements explain much of the security around underground storage. Manuscript preservation is serious business, requiring controlled conditions. Allowing unrestricted access would compromise the environmental controls that protect materials from deterioration. The Vatican archives, distinct from but related to the library, have even more extensive underground storage. The Archivio Apostolico Vaticano, officially open to researchers in limited fashion, stores diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, and other official documents generated by the papal bureaucracy over centuries. These archives total approximately 85 kilometers of shelving, a frequently cited figure that sounds more impressive than it actually is. Linear shelf space is a standard archival measurement, but 85 kilometers of shelving doesn't mean 85 kilometers of unique documents. Much of it is routine administrative paperwork, financial records, property transactions, personnel files, and correspondence about mundane church business. The archives are organized by papal reign, with materials from each pope's tenure stored together. This organization reflects administrative history but complicates research, as scholars studying particular topics must consult materials across multiple papal reigns. Access to the archives follows similar procedures as library access, with additional restrictions on recent materials. Documents less than 75 years old are generally sealed, following standard archival practice of protecting contemporary materials that might contain sensitive information or affect living individuals. The gradual opening of sealed periods provides occasional glimpses into previously restricted materials. The 2020 opening of Pius Archives, covering 1939 to 1958, was the most recent example. These openings are carefully staged, with materials reviewed before release to ensure nothing that would genuinely compromise privacy or security is inadvertently disclosed. What do these newly opened archives typically reveal? Mostly routine administrative correspondence, diplomatic reports, and documentation of church governance. Occasionally, something historically interesting emerges, previously unknown details about papal decision-making, diplomatic negotiations, or internal church debates. What they don't reveal are explosive secrets that fundamentally change historical understanding. The Pius archives showed complex institutional behavior during World War II, but didn't produce smoking gun evidence of either heroic resistance or complete complicity with Nazi Germany. Reality, as usual, proved more nuanced than either extreme narrative suggested. The physical infrastructure of underground storage, while less romantic than legends suggest, reflects serious institutional commitment to preservation. The Vatican has invested substantially in climate-controlled storage, conservation laboratories, and digitization facilities. These investments serve the practical goal of ensuring materials survive for future generations. Security measures protect these facilities not because they hide terrible secrets, but because they house irreplaceable materials. A fire in the underground storage would be catastrophic, destroying unique historical documents. Unauthorized access could result in theft or damage. The security is proportional to the material's value and vulnerability. Comparison with other major archives is instructive. The U.S. National Archives has underground storage at multiple facilities, including the famous facility beneath a mountain in Virginia, where especially valuable materials are stored in case of nuclear war. The British National Archives has climate-controlled underground storage at Kew. These facilities serve the same preservation purposes as Vatican storage. The difference is that Vatican underground spaces benefit from centuries of architectural accumulation. Medieval basements exist alongside modern facilities. This layering of old and new creates physical complexity that legends elaborate into secret chambers and hidden passages. Archaeological work in Vatican City occasionally uncovers previously unknown spaces. Ancient Roman structures underlie much of the Vatican, as the area was inhabited long before Christianity. When foundations are excavated for new construction or maintenance, ancient walls, chambers, or artifacts sometimes appear. These archaeological discoveries generate temporary excitement about what else might be hidden underground. But discoveries are typically incorporated into the archaeological record, studied, and when appropriate, made accessible to scholars or even public visitors. The Vatican necropolis beneath St. Peter's Basilica, for example, can be visited by tour. The infrastructure reality is that the Vatican Library and Archives have sophisticated underground storage serving conservation purposes, historic tunnel connections between buildings, and occasional undiscovered archaeological spaces from pre-Christian times. This reality is interesting enough without embellishment. The legend of vast secret chambers filled with forbidden knowledge is less accurate, but admittedly more dramatic. Few topics related to the Vatican archives have generated more controversy than Pope Pius' papacy during World War II. The question of what Pius knew about the Holocaust, what he did in response, and whether he should have done more has been debated for decades. The 2020 opening of his archives provided new evidence for this debate. Pius, born Eugenio Pacelli, became pope in 1939, just months before Germany invaded Poland and triggered World War II. He would lead the Catholic Church throughout the war's duration and into the early Cold War period, dying in 1958. His papacy was defined by difficult choices regarding the Church's relationship with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Vatican was surrounded by fascist territory, its sovereignty dependent on maintaining relations with Mussolini's regime. German Catholics represented a substantial portion of church membership. These circumstances created pressures to avoid antagonizing Axis powers. Pius chose a strategy of public neutrality combined with private diplomacy. He avoided explicit public condemnation of Nazi Germany despite being informed about atrocities, including the Holocaust. His defenders argue he worked behind the scenes to save Jewish lives and that public condemnation would have been ineffective or counterproductive. Critics contend he prioritized institutional interests over moral imperative. This controversy intensified in 1963 with the play The Deputy by Rolf Hochhuth, which portrayed Pius as indifferent to Jewish suffering. Subsequent books and articles debated his actions. Jewish organizations, Holocaust survivors, and some Catholic scholars criticized his silence. Other scholars defended him, arguing his situation was more complex than critics acknowledged. The Vatican archives relevant to this period were sealed under the standard 75-year rule. This meant materials from Pius's papacy wouldn't normally be accessible until 2033. However, pressure from scholars and Jewish groups led Pope Francis to accelerate the opening, making materials available in 2020, 13 years early. The opening was significant, providing researchers access to approximately 15 million documents from Pius's 19-year papacy. The sheer volume meant comprehensive analysis would require years. Initial research focused on materials directly relevant to the Holocaust and World War II. What has emerged from this archival opening is a more complete but still complex picture. The documents confirm that Pius was extensively informed about Nazi persecution of Jews. Reports from nuncios, the papal ambassadors, detailed deportations, ghettos, and mass killings. The Vatican knew what was happening. The documents also show Pius authorized various efforts to help Jews. Vatican properties provided hiding places. False documents were produced. Diplomatic interventions were attempted in some cases. The Church did take actions that saved lives, though the scale and effectiveness remain debated. However, the documents also confirm that Pius avoided explicit public condemnation of the Holocaust. His public statements about the war remained carefully worded, condemning atrocities in general terms without specifically naming Nazi Germany or the persecution of Jews. This silence is what critics find inexcusable. Why this silence? The archival materials suggest multiple factors. Pius feared that explicit condemnation would worsen conditions for Catholics in German-controlled territories and might trigger retaliation against the Vatican itself. He believed private diplomacy was more effective than public denunciation, and he prioritized maintaining the Church's institutional independence and ability to operate in post-war Europe. There's also evidence of concern about communism. Pius viewed Soviet Russia as a threat to Christianity, potentially equal to or greater than Nazi Germany. This Cold War perspective, emerging even during the Hot War, may have influenced reluctance to do anything that helped the Soviet Union, Germany's enemy. The complexity extends to Jewish perspectives. Some Jewish survivors credit Catholic clergy with saving their lives, sometimes at great personal risk. Individual bishops, priests, and nuns acted heroically, often without explicit authorization from Rome. Whether this local-level bravery excuses institutional-level caution is a matter of ongoing debate. The archival opening hasn't resolved the controversy so much as provided more evidence for all sides to analyze. Defenders of Pius point to documents showing his concern and the Church's actions. Critics point to documents showing his knowledge and the strategic calculations behind his silence. Both interpretations are supported by evidence. From a historical methodology perspective, the Pius archives demonstrate the value and limitations of documentary evidence. We now have access to the papers Pius saw, the reports he received, the letters he wrote. We can document what he knew and when he knew it. We can trace the institutional decision-making process. What we can't fully access are the subjective elements, the fears, pressures, and moral reasoning that shaped decisions. Documents can tell us what someone did, but not always why, or what they felt about their choices. Historical judgment must be based on actions we can document, but understanding those actions requires acknowledging the limits of what documents can reveal. The archives also contain materials beyond the Holocaust controversy. Diplomatic correspondence documents Vatican relations with Allied and Axis powers. Administrative records show how the Church functioned during wartime. Financial documents trace how the Vatican maintained its operations when normal revenue sources were disrupted. These materials provide evidence for broader questions about the Catholic Church's role in mid-20th century geopolitics. How did the Church navigate between competing powers? How did it maintain its influence when its diplomatic maneuvering room was severely constrained? How did institutional priorities shape responses to moral crises? The gradual nature of archival opening means that even with the pious materials now accessible, there remain sealed portions of Vatican archives. Materials from subsequent papacies are still restricted under the 75-year rule. This means that comprehensive understanding of 20th century Church history must wait for future archival openings. However, the trend is clear. Materials are being opened. Access is being granted. The process is slow by contemporary standards, but consistent with standard archival practice. The Vatican is not unique in restricting recent materials. Most governmental and institutional archives follow similar policies. The Pius case illustrates both the importance of archival access and the complexity of historical interpretation. Access to documents is necessary for informed historical analysis, but documents don't provide simple answers to complex moral and political questions. They provide evidence that scholars must interpret, and reasonable people can interpret the same evidence differently. The controversy also demonstrates why the Vatican maintains restrictions on some materials. Opening archives to research means accepting that what researchers find might be uncomfortable or damaging to institutional reputation. The decision to open the Pius archives, despite knowing they contained evidence that critics would cite, shows commitment to transparency even when the institution might prefer continued secrecy. The Vatican Library has accumulated a remarkable collection of myths, legends, and conspiracy theories. Understanding why these myths persist and what kernel of truth they might contain provides insight into how secrecy generates speculation. One persistent myth concerns extraterrestrial life and the Vatican's alleged knowledge of alien contact. This theory posits that the Church possesses evidence of extraterrestrial existence, possibly including communication from alien civilizations or even physical artifacts. The origin of this myth is traceable. The Vatican does operate an astronomical observatory, the Specola Vaticana, founded in 1891. The observatory's mission is scientific research in astronomy, reflecting the Church's long involvement in astronomical study dating to the calendar reforms of the 16th century. The observatory's existence is sometimes interpreted as evidence of interest in extraterrestrial life. This interpretation received attention in 2008 when José Gabriel Funes, a Jesuit astronomer serving as observatory director, published an interview discussing the theological implications of potential alien life. Funes argued that the possible existence of extraterrestrial intelligent life wouldn't contradict Catholic theology. God could have created life elsewhere in the universe, and such beings might have their own relationship with the divine. This theological speculation is consistent with Catholic tradition of engaging with scientific discoveries. However, Funes' statement has been misinterpreted as confirming the Vatican knows about alien contact. In reality, he was discussing hypothetical theological questions, not revealing secret knowledge. The interview was philosophical speculation about possibilities, not disclosure of facts. The myth persists because it misunderstands the observatory's purpose and misconstrues theological speculation as admission of fact. The observatory studies stars, galaxies, and cosmic phenomena using standard scientific methods. It has not detected alien civilizations or evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. Another persistent myth concerns the Knights Templar and whether the Vatican archives hold secrets about this medieval military order. The Templars were founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. They grew wealthy and powerful, becoming essentially an international financial institution with military capabilities. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the Templars, ordered their arrest on charges of heresy. The order was subsequently suppressed by Pope Clement in 1312. Templar property was confiscated and some members were executed, including the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. The dramatic suppression generated legends that have persisted for centuries. Did the Templars possess secret knowledge, perhaps discovered in the Holy Land? Did they survive in secret, continuing their activities underground? Did the Vatican suppress the order to seize their wealth and eliminate a rival power? The Vatican archives do contain documents related to the Templar suppression, including the Chinon Parchment, a document recording Pope Clement's absolution of Templar leaders. This document was rediscovered in the archives in 2001, having been misfiled or overlooked in previous cataloguing. The Chinon Parchment showed that Clement found the Templars not guilty of heresy, but suppressed the order anyway due to political pressure from Philip. This reveals the suppression was political rather than based on genuine heretical beliefs. However, it doesn't support elaborate conspiracy theories about Templar secrets. The Templar myth persists because the order's dramatic rise and fall invites speculation. The partial destruction of their records means gaps exist in historical knowledge. These gaps allow imagination to fill in missing details. But the archival evidence, while interesting historically, doesn't support theories about secret wisdom or hidden Templar survival. The Illuminati represent another myth connected to the Vatican. The historical Illuminati was a real organization. The Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. It was an Enlightenment-era secret society promoting rationalism and opposing religious influence in public life. The organization was suppressed by the Bavarian government in the 1780s and ceased to exist. Conspiracy theories portray the Illuminati as a continuing secret organization controlling world events. Various theories propose that the Vatican either opposes the Illuminati, collaborates with them, or is controlled by them. These theories lack evidential basis. The Vatican archives contain no special collections about the Illuminati. The historical organization was brief and not particularly significant in its time. Its lasting impact is mainly in conspiracy theory mythology rather than actual historical influence. Why does this myth persist? Partly because the name sounds mysterious and significant. Partly because the idea of hidden groups controlling events appeals to those seeking simple explanations for complex phenomena. And partly because popular culture, particularly Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, has embedded these ideas in public consciousness. Apocalyptic prophecies represent another category of myth. Theories suggest the Vatican Library holds prophecies predicting the end of the world, hidden to prevent public panic. The most frequently cited example involves the prophecies of Saint Malachy, a 12th century Irish bishop. The prophecy of the popes, attributed to Malachy, allegedly consists of short phrases describing each future pope from the 12th century to the end times. The prophecy supposedly predicts that the final pope will reign during the apocalypse. However, the prophecy first appeared in 1595, allegedly discovered in the Vatican Archives, but no earlier source mentions it. Most scholars consider it a 16th century forgery rather than an authentic 12th century document. The descriptions of popes before 1595 are remarkably accurate, while those after are vague, suggesting the prophecy was written with historical knowledge and then projected forward. The Vatican Library does contain apocalyptic texts, including portions of the Apocalypse of Peter and other early Christian apocalyptic writings. These texts are known to scholars and accessible for research. They're theologically interesting, but don't contain specific predictions about contemporary events. The persistence of apocalyptic myths reflects human fascination with end-time scenarios and the appeal of secret knowledge. The idea that authorities hide prophecies about the future creates both anxiety and excitement. But the reality is that apocalyptic literature, while present in the collection, consists of historical religious texts rather than hidden predictions. The myth of Jesus' bloodline and descendants represents another persistent theory, popularized by the Da Vinci Code and related works. This theory proposes that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had children, and that this bloodline continued through history, possibly into European royal families. The theory draws on apocryphal Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Philip, which mentions Mary Magdalene in terms that some interpret as indicating marriage to Jesus. However, the Gospel of Philip doesn't explicitly state this, and scholarly interpretation of the Aramaic text is debated. The Vatican Library does hold copies of the Gospel of Philip and other apocryphal texts mentioning Mary Magdalene. These are scholarly copies, accessible to researchers, and have been extensively studied. They don't contain clear evidence of Jesus' marriage or descendants. The persistence of this myth reflects both fascination with alternative Christian histories and suspicion that the Church suppresses information challenging orthodox doctrine. However, the apocryphal Gospels that exist are well known and studied. If they contained explosive revelations, those revelations would be public knowledge by now. Understanding why myths persist requires recognizing several factors. Restricted access generates suspicion about what's being protected. Incomplete information allows speculation to fill gaps. Popular culture reinforces myths through fictional narratives presented as based on fact. And human psychology includes a tendency to find patterns and conspiracies even where simpler explanations suffice. The Vatican Library does contain remarkable materials, unique manuscripts, important historical documents, and texts that shed light on understudied aspects of history. But the documented reality, while fascinating, is less sensational than the myths. The challenge is maintaining interest in actual history when conspiracy theories are more dramatic. In recent decades, the Vatican Library has undergone significant transformation through digitization projects and modern preservation techniques. These developments represent the institution's adaptation to 21st century expectations regarding access to historical materials. The digitization initiative began seriously in the early 2010s, though planning and pilot projects started earlier. The goal was ambitious: to digitally capture the most important manuscripts in the collection, making them accessible online while reducing handling of fragile originals. The technical challenges were substantial. Medieval manuscripts require high-resolution imaging to capture details of script, illumination, and physical characteristics. Color accuracy is crucial for art historical study. File sizes for complete manuscript scans are enormous, requiring substantial storage infrastructure. The project partnered with technology companies and academic institutions. The Japanese company NTT Data Corporation provided significant funding and technical expertise for digitizing approximately 3,000 manuscripts. Other partnerships with universities and libraries contributed resources and expertise. By the mid-2020s, tens of thousands of manuscript pages had been digitized and made available through the library's website. Scholars worldwide can now access high-resolution images of manuscripts that previously required travel to Rome. This democratization of access represents a major shift in the library's operational philosophy. However, digitization raises complex questions about what should be digitized first. The most important works have obvious priority, but importance is subjective. Well-known manuscripts that scholars frequently request are obvious candidates, but digitizing only famous manuscripts reinforces their prominence while leaving lesser-known materials obscure. The library has attempted to balance multiple priorities: historical importance, conservation need, and research demand. Manuscripts in fragile condition are digitized to reduce future handling. Unique texts not available elsewhere receive priority. Materials frequently requested by scholars are digitized to serve research needs. Not everything digitized is made publicly accessible. Some materials remain restricted even in digital form. This might reflect copyright concerns for recent materials, privacy protections for documents containing personal information, or conservation policies limiting access to particularly fragile or valuable items. The digitization project serves preservation as well as access goals. Digital copies preserve information about manuscripts' current state. If physical deterioration occurs despite conservation efforts, the digital record documents what existed. This archival function is as important as enabling current access. Modern conservation techniques have also transformed how physical materials are preserved. Climate-controlled storage maintains precise temperature and humidity. Air filtration removes pollutants. Specialized lighting minimizes damage from light exposure. These environmental controls extend materials' lifespan significantly. Conservation laboratories employ trained specialists who repair damaged manuscripts, stabilize deteriorating materials, and conduct preventive conservation to stop damage before it worsens. Techniques include paper repair, binding restoration, and treatment of mold or insect damage. Digital technology assists conservation efforts. Multispectral imaging can reveal text that's faded or obscured in visible light. Ultraviolet and infrared imaging show details invisible to normal vision. X-ray fluorescence identifies pigments and inks, providing information about materials and techniques. These analytical tools enable research on manuscripts themselves as physical objects, not just on the texts they contain. Codicology, the study of manuscripts as artifacts, benefits from technology that can examine physical characteristics non-destructively. The library has also modernized its cataloging systems. Database technology enables more comprehensive and flexible cataloging than previous paper-based systems. Searchable catalogs allow researchers to find materials by multiple criteria: author, subject, date, language, material, or various combinations. Standardized descriptive frameworks enable integration with international library catalogs. A scholar searching for manuscripts on a particular topic can search across multiple institutional collections simultaneously, identifying materials in the Vatican and elsewhere. However, cataloging remains incomplete. Many manuscripts lack full descriptive records in the modern database. The backlog of uncatalogued or minimally catalogued materials continues, though progress is being made. Digital technology speeds cataloging but doesn't eliminate the need for expert analysis of each manuscript's content and physical characteristics. The institutional culture around access has also evolved. While restrictions remain, they're now more clearly defined and consistently applied than in the past. The approval process for research access is transparent. Criteria for who qualifies and what materials are accessible are publicly stated. This transparency reduces suspicion about hidden agendas behind restrictions. When rules are clear and consistently applied, researchers understand that denial isn't arbitrary but based on defined criteria. This doesn't eliminate frustration when access is denied, but it makes the system more comprehensible and legitimate. The library has also increased engagement with the scholarly community and general public. Exhibitions display selected materials, publications highlight notable manuscripts, social media accounts share images and information about the collection. These outreach efforts demystify the institution while maintaining necessary restrictions. The transformation hasn't been without challenges. Technology requires ongoing investment. Equipment becomes obsolete. Digital files require migration to new formats as technology evolves. The institutional commitment to digitization and modern preservation must be sustained over decades, not just initial enthusiasm. There's also tension between preservation and access. Every handling of a manuscript causes some wear. Digitization itself involves physical handling that, while careful, still stresses materials. The library must balance the value of enabling access against the cost in terms of wear on irreplaceable materials. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted digitization's value. When the library closed to physical access, digitized materials remained accessible online. Scholars could continue research using digital copies even when they couldn't travel to Rome. This demonstrated that digitization isn't just convenience, but essential infrastructure for maintaining research continuity during disruptions. Looking forward, the library faces continuing challenges. Technology evolves constantly. User expectations change. The balance between preservation and access must be continually renegotiated. And the fundamental question of what materials should be restricted and for how long remains contentious. However, the trend is clearly toward greater openness, enabled by technology but reflecting institutional choice. The Vatican Library is becoming more accessible, more transparent, and more engaged with the global scholarly community. This evolution represents significant change in an institution known for tradition and secrecy. The Vatican Library occupies a unique place in popular culture, appearing in novels, films, and television programs as a symbol of hidden knowledge and institutional secrecy. Understanding this cultural impact helps explain why the library generates such fascination beyond its scholarly importance. Dan Brown's novels, particularly Angels and Demons and The Da Vinci Code, have been extraordinarily influential in shaping popular perceptions. These thrillers present the Vatican as holding dangerous secrets, scientific knowledge suppressed to protect religious doctrine, historical evidence challenging church teachings, and conspiracies involving secret societies. Brown's work is fiction, but it's presented with enough historical detail that many readers believe it's based substantially on fact. The novels include real locations, historical figures, and actual artworks, blending fact and fiction in ways that make distinguishing between them difficult for non-specialist readers. Angels and Demons depicts the Vatican Secret Archives as containing materials about the Illuminati and evidence of the Church's historical conflict with science. The protagonist, Harvard symbologist Robert Langdon, navigates restricted sections of the archives while racing to prevent a terrorist attack. The depiction emphasizes security, secrecy, and the sense that explosive revelations await discovery. The Da Vinci Code focuses on the theory that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and had descendants, with the Church suppressing this history to protect its authority. While the novel's action centers on Paris and London rather than Rome, the Vatican and its archives represent institutional power dedicated to maintaining orthodoxy against historical truth. These narratives resonate because they tap into existing suspicions about institutional secrecy and the relationship between power and knowledge. The idea that authorities hide uncomfortable truths appeals to contemporary skepticism about institutions generally. The specific application to the Church reflects historical awareness of religious censorship and persecution of heretics. Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, though not set at the Vatican, also contributed to popular fascination with secret libraries and forbidden knowledge. Eco's novel features a medieval monastery library containing a dangerous book that the librarian will kill to keep hidden. The library is a labyrinth, both physically and intellectually, protecting secrets that threaten established order. Eco, a medieval literature scholar, wrote with genuine historical knowledge. His depiction of medieval library culture, while fictional, reflects actual history. The notion that certain knowledge was considered dangerous and that libraries could be used to suppress as well as preserve information has historical basis. These cultural representations have real effects on public perception. The Vatican Library is now firmly established in popular imagination as a place of secrets. This affects how news about the library is received. When new materials are digitized or archives opened, media coverage emphasizes what secrets might be revealed rather than the routine scholarly value. The institution has responded to this cultural presence with varying strategies. Official statements emphasize the library's legitimate scholarly mission and the mundane reality of most holdings. Staff give interviews explaining that the majority of materials are routine religious and administrative documents without sensational content. However, the institution also benefits from the mystique. Media attention generated by myths and conspiracy theories increases public awareness of the library. Interest in sensational theories can lead people to genuine historical engagement. Visitors to Vatican City specifically seek out connections to famous fictional depictions. The library and archives have occasionally opened exhibitions designed to counter misconceptions while satisfying public curiosity. Displaying actual documents allows people to see that real historical materials are interesting without being sensational. The goal is to redirect fascination from conspiracy theory to genuine history. Academic historians have a complex relationship with popular representations. On one hand, historians criticize fictionalized accounts for spreading misinformation and making serious scholarship more difficult. When the public believes dramatic myths, explaining more nuanced historical reality becomes challenging. On the other hand, popular interest generated by fiction can create audiences for actual history. People initially attracted by conspiracy theories might subsequently engage with serious historical work. Scholars writing for general audiences can leverage popular interest while correcting misconceptions. The Vatican's historical role in censorship and doctrinal enforcement gives fiction about suppressed knowledge some plausibility. The Index of Forbidden Books existed. The Inquisition did prosecute heretics. Galileo was tried and convicted. These historical facts provide foundation for fictional elaboration. What fiction does is take these historical precedents and extend them beyond evidence. Yes, the Church restricted certain books, but that doesn't mean explosive secrets are hidden. Yes, Galileo was convicted, but his works are now accessible, not perpetually suppressed. The fiction takes historical behavior and imagines it continuing in more extreme forms. Understanding the cultural impact requires recognizing that fiction serves different purposes than historical scholarship. Novels and films are entertainment, not documentation. They create dramatic narratives, not nuanced analysis. The problem arises when fictional narratives are mistaken for factual claims. The Vatican Library will likely continue being featured in fiction. The institutional aura of secrecy, regardless of actual policies, makes it a compelling setting. Ancient manuscripts, restricted access, and potential revelations provide ready-made dramatic elements. The question is whether growing transparency will reduce the mystique or whether popular fascination is essentially independent of reality. If the library digitizes its entire collection and makes everything accessible online, will that eliminate conspiracy theories, or will theories simply shift to claiming that the real secrets remain hidden even from digitized materials? The persistence of conspiracy theories, despite contrary evidence, suggests that fascination with Vatican secrets isn't primarily about actual restricted access. It's about what the Vatican symbolizes: institutional power, religious authority, ancient history, and the relationship between knowledge and control. These symbolic associations generate stories regardless of mundane reality. From the institution's perspective, the challenge is managing this cultural presence while pursuing the scholarly mission. The library must serve researchers' legitimate needs while acknowledging public interest. Finding the balance between necessary restrictions and maximum feasible openness is an ongoing process. The Vatican Apostolic Library represents a unique intersection of religious authority, historical preservation, and institutional memory. For over 5 centuries, it has served as repository for materials documenting Christianity's development, European political history, and human intellectual achievement across disciplines. Understanding the library requires distinguishing several categories of information it contains. First, there are materials of clear historical significance, documents that shaped major events, texts that influenced intellectual history, and records providing primary source evidence for understanding the past. The letter from Henry VIII requesting marriage annulment, the Galileo trial protocols, and extensive diplomatic correspondence fall into this category. These materials are historically important, regardless of anyone's religious beliefs or political views. They document how events unfolded and provide evidence for historical analysis. Second, there are routine administrative materials documenting institutional operations. Financial records, property transactions, personnel appointments, and ordinary correspondence comprise the majority of archival holdings. These materials have scholarly value for historians studying institutional history, but don't contain sensational revelations. Third, there are theological and liturgical materials reflecting the Church's religious mission. Biblical manuscripts, patristic writings, theological treatises, and liturgical texts document Christian tradition and practice. These materials are important for religious studies and theology, but aren't secular secrets. Fourth, there are materials that are restricted for legitimate reasons, having nothing to do with suppressing explosive secrets. Recent documents subject to privacy concerns, fragile manuscripts requiring controlled access, and materials whose premature disclosure could damage diplomatic relationships or personal privacy fall into this category. Understanding these categories helps evaluate claims about what the library hides. Much speculation focuses on imagined Category 5, explosive secrets that would undermine religious doctrine, reveal hidden history, or expose institutional wrongdoing. While the library undoubtedly contains materials documenting controversial institutional decisions, the notion of secrets that would revolutionize understanding, if revealed, is largely imaginative. The gradual opening of previously sealed materials demonstrates this. When archives are opened after decades of restriction, what emerges is typically historical complexity rather than simple revelation. The Pius XII archives showed neither the heroic resistance nor complete moral failure that extreme narratives posited. Reality was more ambiguous, as it usually is. The library's restrictions stem from multiple legitimate concerns. Conservation requires limiting physical access to fragile materials. Privacy protections prevent inappropriate disclosure of personal information. Diplomatic discretion maintains relationships necessary for institutional functioning. And yes, sometimes institutional reputation is protected by delaying access to materials documenting controversial decisions. These various justifications for restriction aren't equally legitimate. Conservation and privacy are uncontroversial. Diplomatic discretion is understandable, even if sometimes frustrating, for researchers. Protecting institutional reputation is the most problematic justification, as it potentially privileges institutional interests over historical understanding. However, even this last category doesn't necessarily involve suppressing earth-shattering secrets. More often, it means delaying access to materials that, while eventually released, might be embarrassing or require contextual explanation that takes time to develop. The Church's handling of sexual abuse scandals, its financial operations, and its political entanglements all involve information that institution would prefer to contextualize rather than have released immediately. The trend toward greater transparency reflects several factors. Digital technology makes broader access feasible in ways that weren't previously possible. Contemporary expectations regarding institutional transparency have shifted, and the Church recognizes that excessive secrecy generates more suspicion than openness, even when openness reveals uncomfortable information. Comparing the Vatican Library to other major institutional archives provides perspective. Governmental archives worldwide restrict recent materials. Corporate archives limit access to proprietary information. University archives protect student and personnel records. All institutions balance transparency against legitimate confidentiality concerns. The Vatican's restrictions are more extensive than some secular institutions, but the difference is degree rather than kind. And as religious authority, the Church faces unique challenges regarding materials that touch on theological claims that believers consider divinely revealed truth rather than human interpretation subject to revision. The fundamental question the library raises is about the relationship between knowledge, power, and institutional preservation. Institutions accumulate information relevant to their operations. This information becomes institutional memory, shaping how the institution understands itself and operates. But this same information can be used to hold institutions accountable for their actions. The tension between institutional self-preservation and historical accountability is unavoidable. Institutions want to control their narratives. Scholars want access to evidence for independent analysis. The public wants transparency from powerful institutions. These interests don't perfectly align, creating ongoing negotiation about access and restrictions. The Vatican Library will continue being the subject of speculation and myth. The combination of age, religious significance, historical importance, and continued restrictions ensures ongoing fascination. Some of this fascination reflects legitimate interest in understanding history. Some reflects human attraction to mystery and conspiracy. What the library actually contains is simultaneously less dramatic and more important than myths suggest. Less dramatic because most materials are routine documents without earth-shattering revelations. More important because these materials enable understanding of how one of history's most influential institutions developed, operated, and shaped events across centuries. The challenge for scholars is cutting through myths to access actual materials. The challenge for the institution is maintaining necessary restrictions while providing maximum feasible access. And the challenge for the public is distinguishing between evidence-based history and attractive fiction. The lessons from the Vatican Library extend beyond this particular institution. They concern how societies preserve knowledge, how institutions manage information that affects their legitimacy, and how transparency and secrecy must be balanced in ways that serve both scholarly inquiry and legitimate institutional needs. First, preservation requires ongoing commitment and resources. Documents don't preserve themselves. Without active conservation, climate control, and proper storage, materials deteriorate and information is lost. The Vatican's investment in preservation infrastructure demonstrates recognition that institutional memory requires constant maintenance. Second, access and preservation exist in tension. Every handling of fragile materials causes wear. Unrestricted access would damage or destroy irreplaceable documents. But excessive restriction defeats the purpose of preservation, which is ultimately to enable information to be used, not simply to exist in sealed storage. Finding the appropriate balance requires case-by-case judgment. Some materials can withstand frequent handling. Others are so fragile that even limited access risks damage. Digital surrogates help by enabling access without physical handling, but digitization itself requires handling, and not all information can be captured photographically. Third, cataloging is fundamental to access. Materials that aren't cataloged are effectively lost, even if physically preserved. The Vatican's incomplete cataloging demonstrates that even major institutions with substantial resources struggle with this basic requirement. Creating comprehensive, searchable catalogs requires expertise, time, and funding that often aren't adequately prioritized. Fourth, transparency about restrictions builds trust more effectively than secrecy about secrecy. When institutions clearly explain what's restricted and why, skepticism decreases. When restrictions appear arbitrary or their justifications are unclear, suspicion flourishes. The Vatican's gradual movement toward clearer access policies represents recognition of this principle. Fifth, institutional archives are always political. What's preserved, what's accessible, and when access is granted, reflect power dynamics and institutional interests. Recognizing this doesn't mean dismissing all restrictions as illegitimate, but it requires critical awareness that archives are constructed rather than neutral repositories of everything that happened. Sixth, popular imagination will fill gaps in knowledge. When information is restricted or incomplete, speculation emerges. Some speculation is creative fiction, acknowledged as such. Other speculation presents itself as hidden truth. Institutions can't eliminate speculation, by restricting access. If anything, restriction encourages it. The specific case of the Vatican Library illustrates these general principles in the context of an institution with unique characteristics. As religious authority, the Church claims to represent divine truth, complicating its relationship with historical evidence that might challenge official narratives. As political entity, the Vatican has diplomatic relationships requiring discretion. As cultural institution, it holds materials of interest to scholars and the public worldwide. These multiple roles create complex and sometimes conflicting obligations. The Church's religious mission might suggest controlling narratives about Church history. Its scholarly commitments suggest providing access to materials, regardless of what they reveal. Its political interests suggest protecting diplomatic communications. Its cultural custodianship suggests sharing treasures with humanity. No policy can perfectly satisfy all these obligations. Every decision about what to preserve, catalog, restrict, or open involves trade-offs between competing legitimate concerns. Understanding these trade-offs doesn't require accepting every restriction as justified, but it does require recognizing that institutions face genuine dilemmas in managing historical materials. Looking forward, several trends seem likely to continue. Digitization will expand, making more materials accessible remotely. This technological change enables broader access while potentially protecting physical materials from handling. However, digitization is expensive and time-consuming, meaning comprehensive digital access remains distant. Cataloging will improve, as digital tools enable more efficient description and as the backlog is gradually addressed. Better catalogs will help researchers identify relevant materials without requiring speculative requests to see if something relevant might exist uncatalogued. Archival openings will continue as materials pass beyond the restriction period for recent documents. Each opening will provide new information and likely generate both scholarly papers and media speculation about secrets revealed. The pattern established with the Pius XII archives will probably repeat for subsequent papacies. Cultural fascination with Vatican secrets will persist. Fiction will continue using the library and archives as settings for narratives about hidden knowledge and institutional conspiracy. This cultural presence will ensure ongoing public interest, which can support scholarly work even as it sometimes distorts understanding. Academic research will continue producing serious historical scholarship based on archival materials. This scholarship provides the evidence-based alternative to sensationalized accounts. While serious history typically attracts less attention than conspiracy theories, it gradually builds cumulative understanding of how the Church and the broader world developed. The fundamental reality is that the Vatican Library contains exactly what an institution of its age and importance would be expected to contain: extensive documentation of its activities, collected materials related to its mission, and accumulated materials that happen to come into its possession across centuries. This is simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it's what major institutional archives contain: records, correspondence, administrative materials, and collected texts. Extraordinary because the institution involved is one of history's most significant, operating continuously for 2 millennia, involved in major events across that span, and holding unique materials available nowhere else. The secrets of the Vatican Library are primarily the secrets of history itself: the complexity of human behavior, the ambiguity of moral choices in difficult circumstances, and the reality that institutions are made up of people making decisions based on imperfect information under various pressures. These human realities are documented in the millions of pages preserved in climate-controlled storage, awaiting researchers who will spend careers trying to understand what they reveal. Understanding what the library actually contains requires patient historical research rather than speculation about explosive hidden revelations. The real stories documented in the archives are about how Christianity developed across centuries, how the Church navigated political complexities, how theological debates were resolved or papered over, and how individuals within the institution made choices that shaped history. These documented realities are more valuable than imagined secrets. They provide evidence for understanding how one strand of human civilization developed. They document failures and achievements, compromises and principles, political calculations and genuine faith. They show human beings and human institutions in all their complexity. The Vatican Apostolic Library will continue serving its dual mission, preserving institutional memory and enabling scholarly research. The tension between these missions will persist, as will debates about whether the balance between preservation and access is appropriate. But the trend toward greater transparency, enabled by technology and driven by contemporary expectations, suggests that more of the collection will become accessible over time. What researchers will find as access expands is probably less sensational, but more historically significant than myths suggest. Not explosive secrets that overturn understanding, but detailed evidence that enables more nuanced and comprehensive historical analysis. Not hidden knowledge that authorities suppressed, but ordinary information that simply required time, resources, and institutional will to make accessible. The ultimate lesson of the Vatican Library is about the fragility and value of institutional memory. Preserving information across centuries requires sustained commitment. Providing access requires overcoming institutional tendencies towards secrecy. Balancing legitimate restrictions against scholarly needs requires ongoing negotiation. And understanding what materials reveal requires patient research and critical analysis. The library stands as a reminder that human knowledge, human history, and human institutions are all constructed through accumulation of information, decisions about what to preserve and share, and interpretation of materials that survive. The secrets it holds are primarily the secrets of how humanity understands itself through examining its past. These secrets are worth seeking, not because they'll overturn everything we know, but because they enable fuller understanding of how we came to be what we are. For researchers, the Vatican Library remains an essential resource requiring persistent effort to access. For the institution, it remains both asset and challenge, containing materials that document both achievements and failures. For the public, it remains a source of fascination that blends legitimate interest in history with romantic notions of hidden knowledge. And for history, it remains one of the great repositories of human civilization's long, complex, often contradictory development. The Archives Secretos, the secret archives, are secret primarily in the Latin sense of secretum, set apart, rather than deliberately hidden. They're separated from general access by restrictions serving multiple purposes, some more legitimate than others. But they exist, they're gradually becoming more accessible, and they contain evidence for understanding history in ways that justify the effort required to access them. This is the reality of the Vatican Apostolic Library. Neither the repository of earth-shattering secrets that conspiracy theories imagine, nor simply a mundane collection of routine documents. It's a major institutional archive containing unique materials of genuine historical importance, preserved with serious commitment to conservation, accessible under restrictions that sometimes frustrate researchers, but increasingly being opened through digitization and policy evolution. Understanding this reality requires moving past myths to engage with documented evidence and recognizing that the truth, while less dramatic than fiction, is ultimately more significant. Thank you for watching. See you in the next documentary.